Hello again, everyone, and welcome to our Chapter 18 lecture series for your textbook, Give Me Liberty by Dr. Eric Foner. This chapter covers the Progressive Era, 1900 to 1916. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of the chapter itself, we really need to establish exactly what is progressivism. Really, progressivism and the progressive movement was a reaction to the industrialization and modernization that was occurring during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And the new questions these phenomena raised about the nature of government's role in these processes and the nature of the relationship between government and society itself. Such questions included things like, how can society accommodate and integrate modernization and retain core values and principles? Do those values and principles need to change with the times? What is the government's role in reconciling civil society with progress and modernization? Now, the traditional view of American government held that government did not have the right or authority to interfere with social issues. The government's primary role was to protect property. Now, this included property of self, which is why we have laws against things like murder or assault. That still fundamentally comes down to this idea of property. Progressives, however, came to believe that not only did the government have the right to and authority to interfere with social issues, but that it should play a substantial role in addressing and policing such issues. This was a substantial shift in the mindset of many Americans about the nature of government's role in these processes and government's relationship with the people and society. So now that we've established at least a basic understanding of what progressivism is, we can move forward into the actual chapter itself. The first section that we will cover is called An Urban Age and a Consumer Society. The focus question for this section is, why was the city such a central element in progressive America? The growth of cities and urban areas increased exponentially in the progressive period. Explosive economic growth was fueled by industrial production, a rise in population, and an expansion of the consumer marketplace. And this economic growth and expansion fueled the growth of cities as people began to gravitate to them more and more, seeking economic and social opportunities. The city quickly became the focus of progressive politics and a mass consumer society unlike anything that had been previously seen in American history. Stark inequality, however, continued in the cities even as their landscapes and energies captured the imagination of many American artists as the very embodiment of modernity. This celebration of the city, of the urban center, as the very embodiment of modernity was not universally held among Americans, however. Others saw the city as a place where greed undermined traditional American values. And in this period, a new generation of journalists engaged in a new style of journalism called muckraking, which is defined as the use of journalistic skills to expose the ills of urban life. And probably the most preeminent example of this style of journalism was Upton Sinclair's 1906 novel, The Jungle, which basically detailed the inhumane working conditions and the unsanitary handling conditions of meatpacking plants in Chicago in the late 19th century. And The Jungle, which is still widely read today, was the most influential novel of the era and led directly to the passage of regulatory legislation regarding specifically the sanitary conditions of these meat processing plants, which ultimately led to the creation of government organizations like the Federal Food and Drug Administration. In the last chapter, we began talking about a new transformation or transition of immigration patterns into the United States in the late 19th century, as the numbers of Central and Western European immigrants declined, and there was a substantial increase in the numbers of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, as well as from Asia and even Latin America in this period. This new immigration peaked in the progressive era. But it's important to note that these new patterns of immigration form part of a larger process of worldwide migration set into motion by industrial expansion and the decline of traditional agricultural practices. There was a massive shift of peoples throughout the world, and the United States was no exception to this broader global process. Most European immigrants came through Ellis Island, which is in New York Harbor, and you see a picture of that immigration processing center right here, as an influx of Asian and Mexican newcomers took place in western United States. Most of these new immigrants clustered in the cities that emerged around industrial centers, which was the primary location of the economic opportunities these new immigrants were seeking. Most of these new immigrants imagined the United States as a land of freedom, and they had a largely economic understanding of the term freedom, which for most of these immigrants simply meant an escape from poverty itself. A majority wanted to earn enough money to return home and purchase land in their country of origin. Most lived in close-knit ethnic neighborhoods, and this is why at this time you see the emergence of places like Chinatown in San Francisco and Little Italy in New York City. Most of these immigrants were low-skilled laborers and took the low-skilled industrial jobs that were widely available in these industrial centers, and most endured dangerous working conditions and low wages. However, it's also important to keep in mind that for a majority of these immigrants, even those low wages was a substantial increase in their situation that they had faced back at home. The chart you see here illustrates this dramatic increase in the population of urban areas between 1880 and 1920. As you can see, in 1880, only 20% of the population lived in urban centers, and there were only 12 cities in the United States with a population greater than 100,000. By 1920, that percentage had dramatically increased from 20 to 68% of the population of the United States living in and around these urban centers, and the number of cities with a population greater than 1,000 had more than doubled from 12 to 26 by 1920. To illustrate the importance of immigration to the rise and growth of cities and urban areas in this period, this chart here illustrates immigrants and their children as a percentage of the population of these particular urban areas listed. As you see, at the bottom of the list is Los Angeles, with almost half, 45% of the population in Los Angeles were either immigrants or children of immigrants. On the high side of that, New York City, 76% of the population of New York City in this period were either immigrants or children of immigrants, which helps to illustrate the importance of immigration to this process of urban growth in the progressive era. In this period, cities became the birthplace of what can be termed a mass consumption society. And really, consumption itself is the backbone of industrialization, as in order to be profitable, industrialists had to actually sell, to market the products that they produced. The vast array of goods produced in factories became available to people across the nation, and new marketing campaigns and advertising campaigns exploded on the scene as industrialists battled each other for the consumer's dollar. And this helped to form a foundation for a new understanding of freedom. And this new understanding of freedom meant access to goods made available by modern capitalism. And this included leisure activities and mass entertainment. This period also saw a dramatic increase in the numbers of women participating in the workforce as industrialization opened up new job opportunities for the working woman. And this new visibility of women in urban public places indicated a dramatic change in traditional gender roles. The working woman became a symbol of female emancipation, even as they faced wage discrimination and exclusion from many jobs. Most of the jobs that were becoming available to women were still tied, somewhat at least, to this idea of separate spheres for men and women, as the jobs available for women were still seen as connected to traditionally the woman's sphere of influence, things like seamstresses, secretaries, nurses, and teachers. Many disputes occurred in immigrant families of all nationalities about the proper activities and behavior of their free children, especially daughters, as many of these immigrants came from places where those traditional gender roles still held a firm grip on their societies. This period also saw the rise of a new economic theory and ideology known as Fordism, based on the work of Henry Ford. And Henry Ford himself exemplified this new consumer society. He founded Ford Motor Company in 1905, and he developed the techniques of production and marketing that brought the automobile within the reach of ordinary Americans. He adopted what was known as the moving assembly line, which greatly sped up and made the process of manufacturing much more efficient. High wages attracted skilled laborers, but working conditions were monotonous and generally undesirable. And the term Fordism itself came to describe an economic system based on mass production and consumption. These transformations and transitions that we have been discussing generated new ideas about what it meant to be American within the context of this new industrial consumer society. A new advertising industry sprang up that perfected the ways of increasing sales by linking goods and consumerism with the very idea of freedom itself. And economic abundance came to define the American way of life. And this raised also new questions about a standard of living that would be comfortable for all Americans. And new concepts began to be bandied about, including things like living wages and an American standard of living, which offered a new critique of wealth and power inequalities. And some people began to argue and consider that a decent standard of living was a fundamental right of citizenship itself. With that, we conclude part 1 of our Chapter 18 lecture series. As always, study hard, and I'll see you soon.